I'm Greg Garbos from Four Season Tools. We're here installing a ridge vent on top of a stationary high tunnel. A ridge vent is a great ventilation system because hot air rises. It's one of the best passive ventilation systems that allows that hot air to get out to the top of the tunnel where that hot air is already headed. Ridge vents are a little complicated to install. Plus, you have to be very careful when installing them because you're up so high because you're on these tall ladders. We use 10 and 12 foot step ladders to install it. You can also use extension ladders if you've already really built your building and you're really confident that everything's already braced and that the building's sturdy. So let's talk about some of the different components that are being used. There's two different styles of ridge vents. One is a style that uses only metal components, and there's also another style that operates the same way, but it uses some lumber. We like the metal because it's really durable. It is a little bit more expensive, but it also is a little bit more difficult to install because metal is really unforgiving. The different components, we have the ridge vent frame, which is this big, almost L-shaped piece right here. It attaches to our roof hoops with a 2 3/8 inch brace band, and on the back side of it at the peak, it's screwed in with self-tapping screws. We then have a purlin. This is our ridge vent purlin. It runs along the entire ridge of the structure. The ridge vent purlin is the same as the rest of the purlins, except it runs along the ridge vent. All the other purlins are installed using purlin ends. This device in particular, or this purlin in particular, does not use that since the ridge vent frame bends around it. This funky aluminum extrusion right here is called roll lock. This is a 12-foot piece of roll lock, and it allows the roll bar that will be part of this roll-up ridge vent to tuck underneath it to make a seal. It's got a built-in plastic attachment channel on the top that also helps the screw heads from hitting the plastic, and it's got another really small channel on the bottom that also helps the screw heads from hitting the plastic and can be used to make up the flat between this and the piece underneath it. For the top of the roof plastic, in this scenario, because we're using a metal system, has double plastic attachment channel. If we had lumber, what we would do is we'd lay a 2 by 6 piece of lumber flat on the top of the roof with a 2 by 4 piece of lumber coming vertically up against that. The roll lock, instead of the bottom of the roll lock screwing into the ridge vent frame, the bottom of the roll lock would be rotated out slightly and it would screw in to the top of the 2 by 4. Then instead of having double plastic attachment channel like we have here, we'd have a single piece of single plastic attachment channel that would be towards the bottom of that piece of lumber. So those are some of the different components. Quickly, it is important to understand that when we install this, that we need to make sure that we have a pocket in between our first two hoops. So we have single plastic attachment channel up here. We have one piece of single plastic attachment channel that runs along the entire ridge vent purlin, and that's for the roof plastic that will go to the other side. We also have a couple smaller pieces of plastic attachment channel. We've got two vertical pieces on the right and on the left, and we also have another piece that we installed on the underside. So when we install a piece of plastic that will permanently stay in place, it'll go into the top of the roll lock, the two pieces of plastic attachment channel on the side, and the one piece on the top. That'll ensure that when the ridge vent is closed, that the cold air has to come all the way through these two hoops before it can enter the system and makes a nice seal. If you don't put a pocket in, the cold air can come right in from the end of the roll-up ridge vent. Other things that are important to understand is that when we install our double plastic attachment channel, we install it with brace bands, just like we do our metal hip boards. So we drill 2 holes inside of our plastic attachment channel. We use some channel locks to flex that out to get the bolts in place. All the middle hoops are installed with a 2 3/8 inch pipe strap. So before we screw the double plastic attachment channel in from the outside, we have to slide in our 1/4 by 1 inch hex bolts. On the right side, or you can pick a side, we use that hex bolt. On the other side, we went ahead and we drilled a hole. That hole is going to take an eye bolt. Once this is installed and our plastic is in place, we'll put an outer rope wall in place. There'll be an eye bolt over here. We'll start with a rope hook at the top, and we'll allow a zigzag pattern for a rope wall so that wind doesn't come, it flips the ridge vent over, and we'll keep that ridge vent, that roll-up plastic, secured against the structure. Where we locate these things is also important. We have our brace band bolt right here. So what we did was we measured down from our seam on both sides. We made sure we weren't hitting any of our trusses or end wall pieces. Got a nice comfortable measurement. For us, we had to avoid this vertical end wall piece, so we measured 21 inches down from the seam to our ridge hoop to our roof hoop, and that's where the top of our brace band went. We then measured 5 inches below the bottom of the brace band, and that was going to be the top edge of the double plastic attachment channel. As far as where the roll lock goes, this is very important. We need to make sure we have a nice straight line. So we measured up from our brace band bolt 3 inches, and we put a mark on both of our ridge vent frames. So we started with a ridge vent frame on each end and ran a taut string 3 inches up from each end to make sure that our roll lock was always in the right spot and all of our ridge vent frames hit at the same spot. So we got 3 inches up here, 5 inches up here, and now we've basically got our ridge vent frames installed, our roll lock, and our double plastic attachment channel. What we're going to talk about is the easiest way to install ridge vents, the ridge vent frames for a ridge vent on a high tunnel. This is a roll-up ridge vent on top of a stationary high tunnel. There are several different ways to install the vent frames. You can install the ridge vent frames onto the hoops when you're building your trusses or your end walls. We found it a little bit easier to go ahead and install our tunnel and then add our ridge vent afterwards. Either way works fine. So what we did is we started by making an assembly. We built our first 3 ridge vent frames and it secured them to our ridge vent purlin. So we had our first ridge vent frame, our second, and our third. We put them to the ridge vent purlin, and we secured our plastic attachment channel on the top and the channels that we have for our pocket. Once we built that as an entire assembly, we could then lift that assembly into place and secure it where we wanted to secure it. When you put your ridge vent frames in place, it's really important to make sure that you don't interfere with anything. Where this ridge vent frame comes down, you want to make sure that you're avoiding any of your trusses, any of your support braces. In this case, we had to make sure that we missed our vertical brace for our end wall. So what we did was we measured down from the seam of our roof hoop and our ridge hoop. In this case, 21 inches was a good measurement to the top edge of our brace band. So we put up that full assembly as 3 pieces. It took several of us to do it. Once we got it up here, we put this brace band exactly where it needed to go. On the next 2, we went ahead and we cheated them up a little bit to get them out of the way. After we had our first 3 in on this side, we went to the other side and we did the same thing. We put our first 3 vent frames in as an assembly. We went ahead and measured down, get the same dimension from the other side, used that same 21-inch measurement. When we installed it, we put the next 2 hoops in, cheated them up. That allowed us to run a really nice string from the ridge vent frame on each end wall from one side all the way to the other side. When we ran that string, we measured 3 inches up from our brace band bolt, and that was going to be the bottom of our roll lock. We did that for our metal roll-up sides. If this was lumber, we'd have a 2x6 laying flat on the roof and a vertical 2x4 behind it. In that scenario, the roll lock would just come down and be right on top of the top edge of the 2x4. Once we had our string nice and tight, we went through and then we put all of our ridge vents into their final location. One really helpful tool is to have a magnetic level. So we put our magnetic level onto our ridge vent frames to ensure that as we build these ridge vent frames that we build them plumb to the ground. Another thing that's really helpful to do is to have someone stand far back from the tunnel and look at it and give a nice sight line to make sure that as you install your ridge vent frame, you install it in the plane of the tunnel. Once we had comfortable with where our 2 end wall ones are, how our string was laid, we then went back through and we plumbed up all of our ridge vent, the front of our ridge vent frames. We had someone sight it to make sure that we were in the plane of our hoop. Once we had it plumb and we had it in the right plane, we went and had another ladder at the peak of the tunnel, and then we used a hammer. We banged the back end of that ridge vent frame so that it contoured nicely to the top of that roof hoop, and then put several self-tapping screws into the back end of the ridge vent frame. We also found it easier to go ahead and pre-drill all the holes for the ridge vent frame on the ground. That way it was a lot easier when you're in a precarious situation on the top of a ladder trying to get those self-tapping screws in. We put 4 self-tapping screws in the back end of all these ridge vent frames. Once the screws were in, we used some felt tape. You can also use duct tape just to make sure that those screw heads aren't interfering with the roof plastic. Since that ridge vent frame is curved, we tried to put our screws into the side so they weren't sticking out right from the top of that ridge vent frame, which could interfere with the plastic. It's important to get our ridge vent frames installed properly, because what we're shooting for is that our roll lock is a perfect straight line, since this is going to be how our roll bar seals underneath our ridge vent. So when you're installing the roll lock, it's really important that you start with a nice frame to build it from. And that's the easiest way that I know how to install the ridge vent frames. We're getting ready to install the ridge vent on this 30x96 2-position V-track tunnel. We find that it's really easy to do a lot of the components on the ground. The more than you can do on the ground, the safer it is and the easier it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with 3 ridge vent frames. This will go for the first 3 hoops. So what we have here is we have a ridge vent frame that's going to be for the end wall hoop. We have another ridge vent frame that'll go on the second hoop, and then the third ridge vent frame will go on the third hoop. We've also gone ahead and installed these to the ridge vent purlin. What we did is we took a regular 12-foot 3-inch purlin, we put the swage on that end, and we had a little piece of purlin laying around from some of the other purlins that we cut to fit, so we used that just to extend it a little bit. If we didn't extend this purlin a little bit, this end would start here and then the other end would be right where the ridge vent frame hit. So if we put the first three together, we need to extend that first purlin. We took that ridge vent purlin, we went ahead and we put a purlin plug in it, a finishing cap, just so that it looks nice. We took our ridge vent frame, we bent it around the ridge vent purlin, and we did that for all three spots. When we screwed it together, we made sure to put a single plastic attachment channel on the front edge. This is what will take the roof plastic coming from this side. We went ahead and we put that right on the front edge of the ridge vent. You can also put it on top. I think it's easier to put it on the front. That way when you're putting wiggle wire into it, you're putting wiggle wire into the side and you can be underneath it putting it in as opposed to having to be up on top of it putting it down. So we've got our single plastic attachment channel running all the way. Since we have over 12 feet of purlin and these single plastic attachment channels are 8 feet, we have two pieces here. We got 8 feet. We put screws in all along the way, including 2 for each of the ridge vent frame pieces. Then we have a second single plastic attachment channel that goes further. We didn't screw it in past the third ridge vent frame. That way we can fit that purlin in and still get it in behind that single plastic attachment channel. The other thing that we can do on the ground is we can put in some of the single plastic attachment channel for what will be the pocket. This is a roll-up ridge vent, and we want to make sure that when it's closed, that no cold air comes right in from the end of the ridge vent. So what we do instead is we put a permanent piece of plastic in between the first and second hoop. That way the cold air has to travel all the way past the second hoop to get inside the structure. So what we did was we put a short piece of single plastic attachment channel on the inside of 2 and on the inside of 1 facing each other, so the one on this side faces 2 and the one on 2 faces 1. On the underside, we also put another piece of single plastic attachment channel that runs all the way from the first and second hoop, and that'll be for the top of the pocket. The bottom of the pocket will be installed later, because basically that'll attach to the roll lock, which will attach to these 2 structures. The other thing that we can do is we can put a mark where the bottom of the roll lock is going to go. Since this design is going to have all metal, what we're going to do is we're going to put a mark 3 inches up from a brace band bolt. So I'm going to go ahead, put a bolt in the bottom of that hole, measure up 3 inches and put a mark. I'm only going to put that on the one on each end wall, and that's where we're going to run a string. So once we get this up, we'll go ahead, we'll measure down where our brace band's going to go. We'll measure up that 3 inches, we'll run a string from this ridge vent frame all the way to the ridge vent frame on the other end. That'll give us a nice clean line for our roll lock. When we install the second and third ridge vent frames, we're going to go ahead and cheat those up a little bit so they don't touch the string, so that once the string's in place, we'll be able to slide those down, get them exactly where we want them, and lock it all in place. So now we have a full assembly. We'll hand this up and we'll put this all up as one big piece.